We found ourselves on a Paris avenue full of noise and lights and set out toward Avenarius's Mercedes, which was parked a few blocks away. We were still thinking about the girl squatting on a dark highway with her head in her hands, waiting for a car to run her over. I said, I tried to explain to you that we all carry inscribed within us the reasons for our actions, what the Germans call Grund, a code determining the essence of our fate. That code, in my opinion, is in the nature of a metaphor. You cannot understand the girl we are talking about without a metaphoric image. For example, she goes through life as if it were a valley. She keeps meeting people all the time and addressing them, but they look at her uncomprehendingly and walk on because her voice is so quiet that no one hears it. That's how I imagine her, and I'm sure that she sees herself that way too, as a woman walking through a valley among people who do not hear her. Or another image, she is at the dentist's, sitting in a crowded waiting room. A new patient enters, walks to the couch where she is seated, and sits down on her lap. He didn't do it intentionally. He simply saw an empty seat on the couch. She protests and tries to push him away, shouting, "Sir, can't you see? This seat is taken. I'm sitting here." But the man doesn't hear her. He sits comfortably on top of her and cheerfully chats with another waiting patient. These are two images, two metaphors that define her and enable me to understand her. Her longing for suicide was provoked not by something from outside her. It was planted in the very soil of her being, and it slowly grew and unfolded like a black flower. I accept that, said Avenarius, but you still have to explain why she chose to take her life on one particular day rather than another. How do you explain why a flower unfolds on one day and not on another? Its time has come. The longing for self-destruction slowly grew until one day she was no longer capable of resisting it. I am guessing that the wrongs done to her were probably quite minor. People didn't respond to her greeting. Nobody smiled at her. She was waiting in line at the post office and some fat woman elbowed her way past. She had a job as a saleswoman in a department store, and the manager accused her of not treating the customers with respect. Thousands of times she felt like protesting and shouting, but she never found the courage because she had a weak voice that faltered in moments of excitement. She was weaker than anyone else and was continually being insulted. When evil strikes a man, he shifts it onto others. That's called conflict, quarrel, or revenge. But a weak man doesn't have the strength to shift the evil that strikes him. His own weakness insults and humiliates him, and he is totally defenseless in the face of it. He has no other choice but to destroy his weakness along with his own self. And so the girl's dream of her own death was born. Avenarius looked around for his Mercedes and realized that we were on the wrong street. We turned and walked back. I continued. The death she was longing for did not have the form of going away, but of throwing away. Throwing away the self. She wasn't satisfied with a single day of her life, a single word she had ever said. She carried herself through life as something monstrous, something she hated and couldn't get rid of. That's why she longed so much to throw herself away, as one throws away a crumpled piece of paper or a rotten apple. She longed to throw herself away as if the one doing the throwing and the one being thrown away were two different people. She tried to imagine throwing herself out of a window, but that idea was ridiculous because she lived on the first floor, and the store where she worked was on the mezzanine and had no windows. And she longed to die like a beetle crushed by a sudden fist. It was almost a physical longing to be crushed, like the need to press one's palm against the part of our body that hurts. We reached Avenarius's flashy Mercedes and stopped. Avenarius said, "The way you describe her, one could almost feel affection for her." I know what you're trying to say. If she hadn't decided to send other people to death as well. But that, too, is expressed in the two metaphors I used to introduce her to you. Whenever she spoke to anyone, nobody heard her. She was losing the world. When I say world, I mean the part of existence that answers our call, even if only by way of a barely audible echo, and whose call we ourselves hear. For her, the world was becoming mute and ceasing to be her world. She was completely locked into herself and her suffering. At least, could the sight of the suffering of others tear her out of her isolation? No, because the suffering of others was taking place in a world she had lost, a world no longer hers. If the planet Mars were nothing but one huge ball of suffering where every stone cried out in pain, it would not be able to move us to compassion, because Mars does not belong to our world. A person who finds himself outside the world is not sensitive to the world's suffering. The only event that drew her away from her own suffering for a moment was the illness and death of her little dog. Her neighbor was indignant. She doesn't care about people but weeps over a dog? She wept over a dog because the dog was a part of her world, whereas the neighbor was not. The dog answered her voice. People did not. We fell silent, thinking about the poor girl, and then Avenarius opened the car door and nodded to me. Come on, I'll take you along. I'll lend you some running shoes and a knife. I knew that if I didn't go with him on his tire-slashing expedition, he would never find anyone else and would remain isolated in his eccentricity as if in exile. I had an enormous desire to go with him, yet I felt lazy. Drowsiness was creeping up on me, and chasing around dark streets after midnight seemed like an unimaginable sacrifice. I am going home. I'll walk, I said, and shook his hand. He drove off. I gazed after his Mercedes with the guilty feeling of having betrayed a friend. Then I set out for home, and after a while my thoughts returned to the girl in whom the longing for self-destruction grew like a black flower. I thought one day after work she didn't go home but started walking out of the city. She wasn't aware of anything around her. She didn't know whether it was summer or winter, whether she was walking along a beach or along a factory wall. After all, for a long time now, she had no longer been living in the world. Her only world was her soul. She wasn't aware of anything around her. She didn't know whether it was summer or winter, whether she was walking along a beach or a factory wall. She kept walking only because her soul, full of disquiet, required motion, and it was not able to rest in one place, for without movement, it began to hurt terribly. Imagine an excruciating toothache. Something forces you to pace the room from one end to the other. There is no sensible reason for it, because movement cannot diminish the pain. But without your knowing why, the aching tooth begs you to keep moving. And so the girl kept walking and found herself on a highway with one car after another flashing by. She walked along the hard shoulder, passing one milestone after another. She wasn't conscious of anything. She merely stared into her soul, in which she saw nothing but the same few images of humiliation. She couldn't tear her eyes away from them. Only now and again, when a motorcycle thundered past and the noise hurt her eardrums, did she realize that an outer world existed. But that world was without meaning. It was empty space, suitable only for walking and for shifting her painful soul from one place to another in the hope that it would hurt less. She had long been thinking about letting herself be run over by a car, but cars speeding down a highway scared her. They were 1,000 times more powerful than she. She couldn't imagine where she might find the courage to throw herself under the wheels. She would have to throw herself upon them, against them, and she lacked the strength for that. Just as she lacked the strength to shout back at the manager when he reproached her unjustly. She had left at dusk, and now night had fallen. Her feet hurt, and she knew she didn't have the strength to go much farther. At that moment of exhaustion, she saw on a big illuminated sign the word Dijon. At once, she forgot her exhaustion. The word seemed to remind her of something. She tried to recapture a fleeting memory. Someone she knew came from Dijon, or else someone had told her something amusing that had happened there. Suddenly, she came to believe that the town was pleasant and that the people were different from the ones she had known before. It was as if dance music had suddenly broken out in the middle of a desert. It was as if a spring of silvery water had gushed up in a cemetery. Yes, she would go to Dijon. She started to wave at cars, but the cars kept passing, blinding her with their lights, and didn't stop. The same situation, from which there was no escape, kept repeating itself over and over. She would turn to someone, address him, speak to him, call out, and he would not hear. For half an hour, she kept sticking out her arm in vain. The cars didn't stop. The city of lights, the happy city of Dijon, the dance orchestra in the midst of a desert, receded into the darkness. The world was withdrawing from her once again, and she was returning to her soul, surrounded far and wide by nothing but emptiness. Then she came to a place where a smaller road joined the highway. She stopped. No, the cars on the highway were useless. They would neither crush her nor take her to Dijon. She took the exit and found the quieter route. How to live in a world with which you disagree. How to live with people when you share neither their suffering nor their joys. When you know that you don't belong among them. Agnes is driving down a quiet road in her car, and she answers herself. Love or the cloister? Love or the cloister? Two ways you can reject the Creator's computer and escape it. Love. Agnes had long been imagining the following test. You would be asked whether after death you wish to be reawakened to life. If you truly loved someone, you would agree to come back to life only on the condition that you'd be reunited with your beloved. Life's value is conditional and justified only by the fact that it enables you to live your love. The one you love means more to you than God's creation, more than life itself. This is, of course, a derisive blasphemy toward the Creator's computer, which considers itself the apex of all things and the source of all meaning. But the majority of mankind has never known love, and of those people who believe they have known it, only a few would successfully pass the test conceived by Agnes. They would grasp at the promise of renewed life without asking for any condition. They would give preference to life over love and voluntarily fall back into the Creator's web. If a person is not fated to live with the beloved and subordinate everything to love, there is a second method of eluding the Creator: to leave for a cloister. Agnes recalled a sentence from Stendhal's novel. Il se retira à la chartreuse de Parme. Fabrice left. He retired to the charter house of Parma. No charter house is mentioned anywhere else in the novel, and yet that single sentence on the last page is so important that Stendhal used it for the title, because the real goal of all of Fabrice's adventures was the charter house, a place secluded from people in the world. In the old days, people who disagreed with the world and considered neither its sufferings nor its joys their own withdrew to a cloister. But our century refuses to acknowledge anyone's right to disagree with the world, and therefore there are no longer cloisters to which a Fabrice might escape. There is no longer a place secluded from people in the world. All that remains of such a place is the memory, the ideal of a cloister, the dream of a cloister. Charter house. Il se retira à la chartreuse de Parme. The vision of a cloister. Agnes has been following this vision to Switzerland for 7 years, following the vision of the charter house of Rhodes, secluded from the world. Agnes recalled the special moment she experienced on the day of her departure when she took a final walk through the countryside. She reached the bank of a stream and lay down in the grass. She lay there for a long time and had the feeling that the stream was flowing into her, washing away all of her pain and dirt, washing away herself. A special, unforgettable moment. She was forgetting herself, losing herself. She was without a self, and that was happiness. In recalling this moment, an idea came to Agnes, vague and fleeting, and yet so important, perhaps supremely important, that she tried to capture it for herself in words. What is unbearable in life is not being, but being oneself. The Creator, with his computer, released into the world billions of selves as well as their lives. But apart from this quantity of lives, it is possible to imagine some primordial being that was present even before the Creator began to create, a being that was, and still is, beyond his influence. When she lay on the ground that day and the monotonous song of the stream flowed into her, cleansing her of the self, the dirt of the self, she participated in that primordial being, which manifested itself in the voice of fleeting time and the blue of the sky. She now knows there is nothing more beautiful. The road she drove onto from the highway was quiet, and distant stars, infinitely distant stars, shone over it. Agnes drove on and thought, living, there is no happiness in that. Living, carrying one's painful self through the world. But being is happiness. Being, becoming a fountain on which the universe falls like warm rain. The girl kept on walking for a long time. Her feet hurt, she staggered, and then she sat down on the asphalt precisely in the middle of the right-hand lane. She tucked her head between her shoulders, her nose touched her knees, and her hunched back throbbed with the knowledge that it was exposed to chrome, steel, shock. Her chest was caved in, her poor, weak chest burning with the bitter flame that let her think of nothing but her painful self. She longed for a shock that would crush her and put out that flame. When she heard an oncoming car, she hunched down even more. The noise became unbearable, but instead of the expected shock, she only felt a strong blast of air to her right that spun her halfway around. She heard the squeal of tires, then an enormous crash. With her eyes closed and her face pressed to her knees, she saw nothing and was amazed that she was still alive, sitting as before. Once again, she heard the noise of an approaching car. This time, the blast of air blew her to the ground. The noise of the crash sounded very near, and immediately she heard screaming, indescribable screaming, terrible screaming that brought her sharply to her feet. She stood in the middle of an empty road. About 200 yards away, she saw flames. And from another spot, closer to her, that same indescribable, terrible screaming still rose from the ditch into the dark sky. The screaming was so insistent, so terrible, that the world around her, the world she had lost, became real, colored, blinding, noisy. She stood in the middle of the road, her arms outstretched, and suddenly felt big, powerful, strong. The world, that lost world that had refused to listen, was now returning to her, screaming. And it was so beautiful and so terrible that she, too, felt like screaming, but she couldn't. Her voice died in her throat, and she was unable to revive it. She found herself in the blinding headlights of a third car. She wanted to jump aside, but didn't know whether to go right or left. She heard the squealing of tires, the car went past her, and she heard a crash. At that point, the scream that was in her throat finally came to life. From the ditch, still from the same place, the cry of pain did not cease, and now she answered it. Then she turned and ran away. She ran screaming, amazed that her weak voice was capable of such a scream. At the point where the road crossed the highway, there was a telephone on a pole. The girl picked it up. "Hello? Hello?" Finally, a voice answered at the other end. "There's been an accident." The voice asked her for the location, but she didn't know where she was, and so she hung up and started running back toward the town she had left that afternoon. Just a few hours ago, Professor Avenarius was lecturing me on the importance of slashing tires following a strict sequence. First car, right front. Second car, left front. Third, right rear. Fourth, all four wheels. But that was only a theory with which he hoped to impress the audience of ecologists or his too trusting friend. In reality, he proceeded without any system whatsoever. He ran down the street, and whenever he felt like it, he pulled out his knife and stuck it in the nearest tire. In the restaurant, he explained to me that after each attack, it was necessary to stick the knife back under one's jacket, to slip it into its sheath, and then keep running with one's hands free. For one thing, it was easier to run that way, and then also there were reasons of safety. It isn't wise to risk somebody seeing you with a knife in your hand. The act of slashing must be short and sharp, never lasting more than a few seconds. Unfortunately, dogmatic as Avenarius was in his theories, in practice he behaved quite carelessly, without method, and was dangerously inclined to take the easy way out. He had just slashed 2 tires on a car in an empty street, then he straightened himself up and started to run, still holding the knife in his hand, contrary to all his rules of safety. The next car he was aiming for was parked at the corner. He stretched out his arm while still 4 or 5 steps away, another rule broken too soon. And at that instant he heard a shout on his right. A woman was staring at him, petrified with horror. She must have turned the corner to the corner just as Avenarius's attention was concentrated on the intended target at the curb. They stood stock still, facing each other, and because he, too, was frozen with fear, his arm remained rigidly raised. The woman couldn't take her eyes off the outstretched knife and again cried out. Only then did Avenarius come to his senses and slip the knife under his jacket. To calm the woman, he smiled at her and asked, "What time is it?" As if that question terrified the woman even more than the knife, she uttered a third piercing cry. At that moment, some late-night walkers were crossing the street, and Avenarius made a fatal mistake. If he had taken out his knife once again and begun to wave it furiously, the woman would have recovered from her paralysis and fled, inducing any accidental passers-by to do the same. But he decided to act as if nothing had happened and repeated in a friendly voice, "Can you tell me the time?" When she saw that people were approaching and that Avenarius meant her no harm, she uttered a 4th terrible cry and complained in a loud voice to everyone within earshot, "He threatened me with a knife. He wanted to rape me." With a gesture of complete innocence, Avenarius opened his arms wide. "All I wanted from her," he said, "was the right time." A short man in uniform, a policeman, stepped out from the small crowd that had formed around Avenarius. He asked what was going on. The woman repeated that Avenarius had wanted to rape her. The short policeman timidly approached Avenarius, who pulled himself up to his full, majestic height, raised his arm, and said in a powerful voice, "I am Professor Avenarius." Those words and the dignified manner in which they were delivered made a big impression upon the policeman. He seemed ready to ask the crowd to disperse and to let Avenarius go his way. But the woman, now that she had lost her fear, became aggressive. "You may be Professor Capillarius for all I care," she shouted. "You still threaten me with a knife." A man emerged from the door of a house a few yards away. He walked in a peculiar manner like a sleepwalker, and he stopped just as Avenarius was explaining in a firm voice, "I've done nothing except ask that woman for the time." The woman, sensing that Avenarius was gaining the sympathy of the bystanders with his dignity, shouted at the policeman, "He has a knife under his jacket. He hid it under his jacket, an enormous knife. Search him and you'll see." The policeman shrugged and said to Avenarius, in a manner that was almost apologetic, "Would you kindly open your jacket?" For a moment, Avenarius stood motionless. Then he realized that he had no choice but to obey. He slowly unbuttoned his jacket and then opened it wide so that everyone could see the clever system of straps around his chest, as well as the terrible kitchen knife that was attached to it. The circle of people gasped in amazement while the sleepwalker stepped up to Avenarius and said to him, "I am a lawyer. If you need help, here is my card. I just want to tell you one thing. You are not required to answer any questions. You can demand the presence of a lawyer right from the start." Avenarius accepted the card and put it in his pocket. The policeman took him by the arm and turned to the bystanders. "Go on, move along." Avenarius did not resist. He realized that he was under arrest. After everyone saw the huge kitchen knife hanging at his belly, he no longer found the slightest sympathy among the crowd. He turned toward the man who had introduced himself as a lawyer and given him his card. But that man was already leaving without looking back. He walked toward one of the parked cars and slipped the key into the door. Avenarius had time to glimpse the man stepping away from the car and then kneeling down by one of the wheels. At that moment, the policeman grabbed his arm and led him away. The man by the parked car let out a great sigh. "Oh my God," and began to cry so hard that his body shook with tears. Weeping, he ran upstairs to his apartment and immediately rushed to the phone. He tried to call for a taxi. He heard an unusually sweet voice saying into the receiver, "Paris taxi, please be patient. Someone will be with you shortly." Then he heard music, a chorus of female voices and heavy drumming. After a long interval, the music was interrupted by the same sweet voice asking him to stay on the line. He felt like shouting that he had no patience because his wife was dying, but he knew there was no point in shouting because the voice speaking to him was taped and nobody would hear his protest. Then the music came back, the chorus of voices, the shouting and drumming, and after a while he heard a female voice that was real, as he could tell from the fact that this voice was not sweet, but unpleasant and impatient. When he said that he needed a taxi to take him a few hundred miles from Paris, the voice immediately cut him off. And when he continued to explain that he desperately needed the taxi, music once again sounded in his ear. Drumming, the female chorus, and then after a long interval, a taped voice asking him to be patient and stay on the line. He hung up and dialed the number of his assistant, but instead of the assistant, he heard at the other end the assistant's voice coming from an answering machine, a playful, teasing voice distorted by a smile. "I am glad that you finally remembered me. You have no idea how sorry I am that I cannot speak to you, but if you leave your number, I will gladly call you as soon as I am able." "You idiot," he said, and hung up. Why on earth isn't Bridget at home? She should have been home long ago, he told himself for the 100th time, and went to look in her room, even though it was out of the question that she could have come in without his hearing her. Who else could he turn to? Laura? She would certainly be happy to lend him her car, but she would insist on going along with him, and he couldn't possibly agree to that. Agnes had broken with her sister, and Paul didn't want to do anything against her wishes. Then he thought of Bernard. The reasons he had stopped seeing him suddenly seemed ridiculously petty. He dialed his number. Bernard was in. Paul asked him to get his car out. Agnes had crashed into a ditch. The hospital had just called him. "I'll be right over," Bernard said, and Paul felt a sudden surge of great love for his old friend. He longed to embrace him and to cry on his breast. Now he was glad that Bridget was not at home. Suddenly everything vanished. His sister-in-law, his daughter, the whole world. Nothing remained but he and Agnes. He didn't want any third person to be with them. He was certain that Agnes was dying. If her condition were not critical, They wouldn't have called him in the middle of the night from a provincial hospital. Now he thought of nothing else except reaching her while she was still alive, to be able to kiss her one more time. He was possessed by the longing to kiss her. He was longing for a kiss, a last final kiss, with which he might catch her face, as in a skein, before it vanished and left him with merely a memory. Now he had no choice but to wait. He started to tidy his messy writing table and was startled to realize that at a moment like this he was able to devote himself to such meaningless activity. What did he care whether the table was messy or not? And why had he handed out his card just now to a complete stranger? But he was not able to stop himself. He pushed all the books to one side of the table, crumpled up envelopes from old letters and threw them in the waste paper basket. He realized that this is just the way a person acts when disaster strikes, like a sleepwalker. The inertia of the everyday keeps him on the rails of life. He glanced at his watch. Because of the slashed tires, he had already lost at least half an hour. Hurry, hurry, he was silently saying to Bernard. Don't let Bridget find me here. Let me go to Agnes alone and let me arrive in time. But luck was against him. Bridget returned home shortly before Bernard arrived. The former friends embraced each other. Bernard went back home, and Paul and Bridget got into Bridget's car. He took the wheel and drove as fast as he possibly could. Agnes saw the upright figure of a girl in front of her, a figure sharply lit up by the car's headlights, her arms stretched out as if she were dancing, and it was as if a ballerina were pulling the curtain across at the end of a show. For after that there would be nothing, and nothing would remain of the preceding performance, forgotten in an instant, nothing but that final image. Then there was only fatigue, a fatigue so deep that it resembled a deep well, so deep that the nurses and doctors thought she had lost consciousness, although she was still conscious and surprisingly aware that she was dying. She was even capable of a certain sense of surprise that she felt no sadness, no sorrow, no horror. None of those things she had until then connected with the idea of death. Then she saw the nurse bend over her and heard her whisper, "Your husband is on the way. He's coming to see you, your husband." Agnes smiled. Why did she smile? Something occurred to her from the performance that she had forgotten. Yes, she was married. And then the name emerged, too. Paul, yes, Paul, Paul, Paul. It was the smile of a sudden encounter with a lost word. It was like being shown a teddy bear you haven't seen for 50 years and recognizing him. Paul, she told herself silently and smiled, and that smile remained on her lips, even though she again forgot the cause of it. She was tired, and everything tired her. Above all, she didn't have the strength to bear any kind of glance. Her eyes were closed so that she wouldn't see anyone or anything. Everything happening around her bothered and disturbed her, and she yearned for nothing to happen. Then she remembered once again, Paul. What was it the nurse had said to her? That he was coming? Her recollection of the forgotten performance that had been her life suddenly became clearer. Paul was coming. At that moment she wished intensely and passionately that he would not see her anymore. She was tired. She didn't want anyone looking at her. She didn't want Paul looking at her. She didn't want him to see her dying. She had to hurry with her dying. For the last time, the basic pattern of her life was repeated. She was running and someone was chasing her. Paul was chasing her, and she had nothing in her hands, neither brush nor comb nor ribbon. She was disarmed. She was naked, dressed only in some sort of white hospital gown. She found herself on the last lap where nothing could help her anymore, where she could only rely on the speed with which she ran. Who would be faster, Paul or she? Her dying or his arrival? The fatigue grew deeper, and she had the feeling that she was rapidly moving away, as if someone were pulling her bed backward. She opened her eyes and saw the nurse in a white coat. What was her face like? She couldn't make it out. And then the words came to her. No, they don't have faces there. When he and Bridget approached the bed, Paul saw the body covered with a sheet from head to toe. A woman in a white coat told them she died 15 minutes ago. The shortness of the time that separated him from the last moment that she had still been alive exacerbated his despair. He had missed her by 15 minutes. By 15 minutes, he had missed fulfilling his life, which had now suddenly been interrupted, senselessly severed. It seemed to him that during all those years they had lived together, she had never really been his. He had never really possessed her, and that for the culmination of their love story, he lacked a final kiss to capture her still living in his mouth, to hold her in his mouth. The woman in the white coat pulled aside the sheet. He saw the intimately familiar face, pale, beautiful, and yet completely different. Her lips, though as gentle as ever, formed a line he had never known. Her face had an expression he didn't understand. He was incapable of bending over her and kissing her. Next to him, Bridget started crying. Placed her head on his chest, and shook with tears. He looked once again at Agnes, that peculiar smile he had never seen on her face. That unknown smile on a face with closed eyelids wasn't meant for him. It was meant for someone he did not know. And it said something he did not understand. The woman in the white coat caught Paul firmly by the arm. He was on the verge of The woman in the white coat caught Paul firmly by the arm. He was on the verge of fainting. Part 6. The Dial. Soon after it's born, a baby starts to suck the mother's breast. After the mother weans it away from the breast, it sucks its thumb. Rubens once asked a woman, "Why are you letting your boy suck his thumb? He must be at least 10 years old." She became angry. "You want to forbid him from doing it? It prolongs his contact with the maternal breast. Do you want to traumatize him?" And so the child sucks his thumb until the age of 13, when he readily replaces it with a cigarette. Later on, when Rubens made love to the mother who had defended her offspring's right to thumb sucking, he put his own thumb on her lips during intercourse. She began to lick it, turning her head left and right. Her eyes were closed, and she dreamed that 2 men were making love to her. That small incident was a significant moment for Rubens, for he had discovered a method for testing women. He put his thumb on their lips during intercourse and watched their reaction. Those who licked it were quite unmistakably drawn to collective pleasure. Those who remained indifferent to the thumb were hopelessly blind to perverse temptations. One of the women in whom the thumb test detected orgiastic tendencies was really fond of him. After lovemaking, she took his thumb and clumsily kissed it, which meant, "Now I want your thumb to become a thumb again, and I am happy that now, after all my fantasies, I am here with you, quite alone." Metamorphoses of the thumb, or the movement of hands across the dial of life. The hands on the dial of a clock turn in a circle. The zodiac, as drawn by an astrologer, also resembles a dial. A horoscope is a clock. Whether we believe in the predictions of astrology or not, a horoscope is a metaphor of life that conceals great wisdom. How does an astrologer draw your horoscope? He makes a circle, an image of the heavenly sphere, and divides it into 12 parts representing the individual signs: the ram, the bull, twins, and so on. Into this zodiac circle, he then places symbols representing the sun, moon, and 7 planets exactly where these stars stood at the moment of your birth. It is as if he took a clock dial regularly divided into 12 hours and added 9 more numbers, irregularly distributed. 9 hands turn on the dial. They are the sun, moon, and planets as they move through the universe in the course of your life. Each planet hand is constantly forming ever new relationships with the planet numbers, the fixed signs of your horoscope. The unrepeatable configuration of the stars at the moment of your birth forms the permanent theme of your life, its algebraic definition, the thumbprint of your personality. The stars immobilized on your horoscope form angles with respect to one another, whose dimensions, expressed in degrees, have various meanings: negative, positive, neutral. Imagine that your amorous Venus is in conflict with your aggressive Mars, that the sun, representing your social personality, is strengthened by a conjunction with energetic, adventurous Uranus. that your sexuality, symbolized by Luna, is connected with dreamy Neptune, and so on. But in the course of their motion, the hands of the moving stars will touch the fixed points of the horoscope and put into play, weaken, support, threaten various elements of your life's theme. And that's life. It does not resemble a picaresque novel in which, from one chapter to the next, the hero is continually being surprised by new events that have no common denominator. It resembles a composition that musicians call a theme with variations. Uranus strides across the sky relatively slowly. It takes 7 years for it to traverse a single sign. Let's assume that today it is in a dramatic relation to the immovable sun of your horoscope, for example, at a 90-degree angle. You're experiencing a difficult period. In 21 years, this situation will repeat itself. Uranus will then make an angle of 180 degrees with your sun, which has an equally unfortunate significance. But the similarity will be deceptive, because by the time your sun is attacked by Uranus, Saturn will be in such a harmonious relationship with your Venus that the storm will merely tiptoe past you. It is as if you had a new bout of the same disease, except that now you would find yourself in a fabulous hospital, where instead of impatient nurses, you would be cared for by angels. Supposedly, astrology teaches us fatalism. You won't escape your fate. But in my view, astrology, please understand, astrology as a metaphor of life, says something far more subtle. You won't escape your life's theme. From this it follows, for example, that it is sheer illusion to want to start all over again, to begin a new life that does not resemble the preceding one, to begin, so to speak, from zero. Your life will always be built from the same materials, the same bricks, the same problems. And what will seem to you at first a new life will soon turn out to be just a variation of your old existence. A horoscope resembles a clock, and a clock is a school of finality. As soon as a hand completes its circle and returns to its starting point, one phase is finished. 9 hands turn with varying speed on the horoscope dial, and constantly some phase comes to an end and another begins. When someone is young, he is not capable of conceiving of time as a circle, but thinks of it as a road leading forward to ever new horizons. He does not yet sense that his life contains just a single theme. He will come to realize it only when his life begins to enact its first variations. Rubens was about 14 years old when he was stopped in the street by a little girl roughly half his age, who asked me, "Please, sir, can you tell me the time?" That was the first time a woman, a stranger, addressed him in a formal way and called him sir. He was filled with bliss, and it seemed to him that a new phase of his life was opening up. Afterward, he completely forgot the episode and only recalled it when an attractive woman said to him, "When you were young, did you think?" That was the first time someone had referred to his youth as a thing of the past. At that moment, he evoked the image of the little girl who had once asked him what time it was. And he realized that those two female figures belonged together. They were figures quite insignificant in themselves, met by coincidence, and yet as soon as he established a connection between them, they appeared to him as two significant events on his life's dial. I will put it still another way. Let us imagine that the dial of Rubens' life is placed on some great medieval clock, like the one in Old Town Square in Prague, which I passed regularly for some 20 years. The clock strikes the hour, and a little window above the dial opens. A marionette, a little girl of 7, comes out and asks Rubens what the time is. And then many years later, when that same slow hand comes around to the next number, bells begin to sound, the window opens once again, and a marionette, this time a young woman, emerges and tells him, "When you were young." When he was very young, he did not dare reveal his erotic fantasies to any woman. He believed that every bit of his erotic energy had to be converted into an astounding physical performance upon the woman's body. Besides, his youthful partners were of the same opinion. He vaguely remembers one of them, let us call her by the letter A, who in the midst of lovemaking suddenly braced herself on her elbows and heels to arch her body into a bridge, causing him to lurch and almost fall off the bed. This sporting gesture was full of passionate meanings, for which Rubens was grateful. He was living his first phase. the period of athletic muteness. Gradually, he lost that muteness. He felt very bold when, for the first time, while making love to a young woman, he dared to say aloud the name of some sexual part of her body. But that boldness was not as great as he thought, because the expression he chose was either a gentle diminutive or a poetic paraphrase. All the same, he was enthused by his boldness, as well as surprised that the girl didn't protest, and he began to think up highly complicated metaphors in order to speak in a poetic, roundabout way about the sexual act. That was the second phase, the period of metaphors. At that time, he was seeing girl B. After the usual verbal overture full of metaphors, they made love. When she was approaching her climax, she blurted out a sentence in which she designated her sexual organ by an unambiguous, unmetaphoric expression. That was the first time he had ever heard that word coming from a woman's mouth, which, by the way, is also one of the famous seconds on the dial. Surprised, dazzled, he realized that this crude expression contained more charm and explosive power than all the metaphors that had ever been invented. A short time later, he was invited over by woman C. She was some 15 years older than he. Beforehand, he recited to his friend M all the beautiful obscenities. No more metaphors. He intended to say to that woman during intercourse, but he failed in an odd way. Before he dared to utter these expressions to her, she came out with them herself, and again he was astounded. Not only had she outstripped him in erotic daring, but, most strange, she used exactly the same words that he had been preparing for several days. The coincidence fascinated him. He ascribed it to some sort of erotic telepathy or a mysterious affinity of their souls. So he was slowly entering into the third phase, the period of obscene truth. The fourth period was closely connected with his friend M. The period of telephone. Telephone was the name of a game he used to play when he was between 5 and 7 years old. The children sat in a row and whispered a message to one another, the first to the second to the third, and so on, until the last one said it aloud and everybody laughed at the difference between the original sentence and its final version. As adults, Rubens and M played telephone by saying cleverly formulated, obscene phrases to their girlfriends, and the women, not realizing that they were involved in the game, would pass them on. And because Rubens and M had several lovers in common, or else they discreetly passed their lovers on to each other, they used them to send each other playful greetings. Once, during lovemaking, a woman used an expression that was so improbable, so oddly twisted, that he immediately recognized his friend's malicious creativity at work. Rubens was seized by an uncontrollable urge to laugh, and because the woman took his repressed giggling as a sexual climax, encouraged, she repeated the sentence once more, and then for the third time she shouted it aloud. And in his mind's eye, Rubens saw the ghost of his friend guffawing over his copulating body. In that connection, he remembered girl B, who at the end of the period of metaphors suddenly said an obscene word during lovemaking. Only now, after the lapse of time, did he pose himself the question, was that the first time she had ever said that word? He had never doubted it at the time. He thought she was in love with him. He suspected her of wanting to marry him. He was sure there was no one else in her life. Only now did he realize that somebody else must have taught her, or I might say trained her, to say that word aloud before she'd been able to say it to Rubens. Yes, only many years later, thanks to the experience of telephone, did he realize that at the time she was swearing her faithfulness to him. B undoubtedly had another lover. The experience of telephone changed him. He was losing the feeling to which we are all subject, that the act of physical love is a moment of absolute intimacy, when the world around us changes into an endless desert in the middle of which two isolated bodies press against each other. Now we suddenly realize that the moment of lovemaking yields no intimate isolation. One is more intimately isolated walking down the crowded Champs-Élysées than in the arms of the most secretive of mistresses. For the period of telephone is the social period of love. Thanks to a few words, everyone takes part in embracing apparently isolated beings. Society continually restocks the market of indecent fantasies and facilitates their distribution and circulation. Rubens coined this definition of a nation: a community of individuals whose erotic life is united by the same game of telephone. But then he met girl D, who was the most verbal of all the women he'd ever known. During their second meeting, she confided to him that she was a fanatical masturbator and that she achieved sexual climax by telling herself fairy tales. Fairy tales? What fairy tales? Tell me. He began to make love to her while she narrated. Bathhouse cabin, holes drilled in wooden walls, eyes fixed on her as she is undressing, a door that suddenly opens and 4 men enter, and so on and so on. The fairy tale was beautiful. It was banal, and he was highly pleased with Dee. But a peculiar thing began happening to him from then on. When he was with other women, he found in their fantasies fragments of the long stories told to him by Dee during their lovemaking. He often encountered the same word, the same verbal construction, even though the word or construction sounded quite uncommon. Dee's monologue was a mirror in which he recognized all the women he knew. It was an enormous encyclopedia, an 8-volume Larousse of erotic phrases and fantasies. At first he thought of her great monologue according to the principles of telephone. Via hundreds of lovers, an entire nation was gathering indecent fantasies in every corner of the country and putting them into her head as into a beehive. But later he found out that this explanation was unlikely. He encountered fragments of Dee's monologue even in women he knew with certainty could not have had any indirect contact with Dee, for there was no common lover who could have played the role of messenger. Then he remembered his experience with C. He had prepared indecent sentences to say during intercourse, and she had beaten him to it. At the time, he believed it was telepathy, but had she really been able to read sentences from inside his head? More likely, those sentences had already been present inside her own head long before she had met him. But how was it that they both had the same sentences in their heads? Clearly, there must have been some common source. And then it occurred to him that one and the same stream runs through all men and women, a single common river of erotic fantasies. An individual does not receive a share of indecent fantasy from a lover by means of telephone, but by means of this impersonal, or superpersonal, or subpersonal stream. To say that this river that runs through us is impersonal means that it does not belong to us, but to him who created us and made it flow within us. In other words, that it belongs to God, or even that it is God or one of his incarnations. When Rubens first formulated this idea for himself, it seemed him blasphemous. But then the sense of blasphemy receded, and he immersed himself in the underground river with a certain religious humility. He knew that this stream unites us all, not as a nation, but as God's children. Every time he immersed himself in the stream, he experienced the feeling of merging with God in a kind of mystic rite. Yes, the 5th phase was the mystical period. But is the story of Rubens' life nothing but a story of physical love? It is possible to think of it that way, and the moment when it revealed itself as such was also a significant event on the dial. While still at school, Rubens spent many hours in museums looking at paintings. He painted hundreds of gouache pictures and was famous among his school friends for his caricatures of teachers. He drew them in pencil for a school newspaper, and between classes, he drew them in chalk on the blackboard to the great amusement of his fellow students. That period enabled him to feel what fame was all about. The whole school knew him and admired him, and everybody jokingly called him Rubens. As a souvenir of those beautiful years, his only years of fame, he kept that nickname all his life and insisted, with surprising naivete, that all his friends call him by it. This glory came to an end after school. He applied to the School of Fine Arts but failed to pass the examination. Was he worse than others? Or did he have bad luck? Oddly enough, I don't know how to answer this simple question. With indifference, he began to study law and blamed the narrow-mindedness of his native Switzerland for his unsuccessful start. He hoped that he would fulfill his artistic vocation elsewhere and tried his luck twice more. First, when he applied to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and failed the exam, and then when he offered his drawings to several journals. Why did they reject the drawings? Were they bad? Or were the people who judged them idiots? Or had drawings gone out of fashion? I must repeat once again that I have no answers to these questions. Exhausted by his lack of success, he gave up further attempts. This meant, of course, as he was fully aware, that his passion for drawing and painting was weaker than he had thought, and therefore that he was not destined for the artistic career he had assumed in his student days. At first he was disappointed by this realization, and then a stubborn defense of his own resignation began to resound inside him. Why should he have a passion for painting? What is so praiseworthy about passion? Isn't the cause of most bad paintings and bad novels simply the fact that artists consider their passion for art something holy, some sort of mission, if not duty to oneself, even to mankind? Under the influence of his own resignation, he began to see artists and writers as people possessed by ambition rather than gifted with creativity, and he avoided their company. His greatest rival, N, who was his age, came from the same town, and graduated from the same school, was not only accepted by the École des Beaux-Arts, but soon after gained remarkable success. During their school days, everyone considered Rubens much more talented than N. Does that mean that they were all mistaken, or that talent is something that can get lost along the way? As we can guess, there's no answer to these questions. Anyway, another circumstance arose at a time when his failures induced him to give up painting once and for all, at the same time that N was celebrating his first success. Rubens was seeing a very beautiful young girl, whereas his rival had married a woman from a rich family, a woman so ugly that one look at her made Rubens speechless. It seemed to him that by means of this conjunction of circumstances, fate was trying to show him where his life's center of gravity really lay. Not in public life, but in private. Not in the pursuit of professional success, but in success with women. And suddenly, what only yesterday had seemed like a defeat now revealed itself as a surprising victory. Yes, he would give up fame, the struggle for recognition, a vain and sad struggle, in order to devote himself to life itself. He didn't even bother to ask himself exactly why women represented life itself. That seemed to him self-evident and clear beyond all doubt. He was certain that he had chosen a better way than his rival, wedded to a rich hag. In these circumstances, his young beauty meant not only a promise of happiness, but above all a triumph and a source of pride. In order to consolidate his unexpected victory and to give it a seal of irrevocability, he married the beautiful woman, convinced that the whole world would envy him.